The sky was still dark when Yuna opened her eyes, and the cold air of Vethkora crept through the thin walls of their shelter and touched her face. Like unwelcome fingers, she did not need an alarm to wake her because her body knew the routine, and it knew that every moment of delay meant more danger on the path ahead. Yuna was 12 cycles old, and she had been making this journey for almost 2 full cycles now. And in that time, she had learned that the world did not care about small girls with sick mothers, and it did not care about fairness or justice or any of the things the Galactic Union promised when they moved the Karathi people to this planet. She sat up slowly and looked across the room to where her mother Seelin lay sleeping on the mat near the heating unit. And even in sleep, her mother's breathing was rough and uneven, and the sound of it made Yuna's chest tight with worry. Ash-lung sickness was what the medical scanner called it, and the scanner also said that daily doses of purified mineral water from the valley springs could help manage the symptoms and keep the sickness from getting worse. The scanner did not say anything about how a young girl was supposed to get that water when the path to the springs passed through Vrex territory. Yuna moved quietly and picked up the water vessel from its place by the door, and the vessel was made of lightweight metal, and it could hold enough water for 2 days if she was careful, but she never let it go that long, because what if something happened, and what if she could not make the trip, and what if her mother went without? She wrapped her thin coat around her shoulders and stepped outside into the pre-dawn darkness, and the settlement around her was silent and still, and most of the other Karathi were sleeping, and they would not wake for another hour at least. The Dio and silent and still, and most of the other Karathi were sleeping, and they would not wake for another hour at least. The Karathi were a small species with thin limbs and translucent skin that showed the faint blue lines of blood beneath, and their eyes were large and dark and made for seeing in low light, and their bodies were fragile compared to most other species in the galaxy. They had not evolved for fighting or for surviving on harsh worlds, and their original homeworld had been gentle and kind, and then it had died when the star went unstable, and the Galactic Union had promised to resettle them somewhere safe. Vithkora was not safe. Planet was on the edge of Union space, and the patrol ships came once per lunar cycle, if they came at all, and the Vrex raiders had claimed the surrounding territory as their own, and the Union did nothing about it because the Karathi were not important enough to protect. Yuna walked through the settlement gate and started down the path that led to the valley springs, and she knew every stone on this path and every shadow and every place where she could hide if she needed to. The springs were 3 kilometers away, and in good conditions she could make the round trip in less than 2 hours. But conditions were rarely good. The Vrex were reptilian creatures with scaled skin and sharp claws and teeth that could tear through Karathi flesh like it was nothing, and they were scavengers and raiders who took what they wanted from those too weak to stop them. Most days Yuna saw them watching from the rocks above the path, and most days they let her pass because she was small and had nothing worth taking except water, and they had their own water sources deeper in the territory. But some days they were bored or angry or just cruel, and on those days Yuna came home with bruises and cuts and less water than she had left with, and she never told her mother about those days. Today she moved quickly through the first kilometer, and the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, and she could see the shapes of the trees ahead, and she could hear the sounds of the forest waking up around her. She reached the halfway point and stopped to listen, and the forest was quiet in a way that made her nervous, because when the animals went silent, it usually meant predators were near. Yuna continued forward, more slowly now, and she kept to the edges of the path where the shadows were thickest, and she watched the rocks above for any sign of movement. The springs came into view through a gap in the trees, and she felt a small moment of relief, because maybe today would be one of the good days, and maybe she would make it there and back without trouble. She stepped into the clearing around the springs and knelt by the water's edge and began to fill her vessel, and the water was cool and clear, and it sparkled in the early morning light, and for just a moment everything felt peaceful. Then she heard the sound of scales sliding. Again stony Una looked up and saw 3 wrecks emerging from behind the rocks on the far side of the clearing, and they were large, and their eyes were fixed on her, and their mouths were open in expressions that might have been smiles on a different species. She stood slowly and held the water vessel against her chest, and she knew she should run, but they were already spreading out to block the paths, and there was nowhere to go. Largest wrecks spoke in a rasping voice and said that they had been waiting for her, and that today they wanted more than just water, and that today they were going to teach the Karathi what happened to those who used Rex territory without permission. Una backed up until she felt the cold water of the spring against her heels, and she could not go any further, and the 3 wrecks were moving closer, and their claws were extended, and she could see the hunger in their eyes. She thought about her mother waiting at home, and she thought about what would happen if she did not return, and she felt tears building behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall because she would not give these creatures the satisfaction. The wrecks circled her, and one of them reached out and knocked the water vessel from her hands, and it clattered against the rocks, and the water spilled out onto the ground, and Una watched it drain away and felt something inside her break. Then a shadow fell across the clearing. The wrecks stopped moving and turned their heads toward the tree line, and Una followed their gaze and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall and stood on 2 legs like the Karathi, but it was much larger and much broader, and its skin was a warm brown color, and its hair was dark, and its eyes were calm and steady as they looked at the scene before them. Una had never seen a human before, but she had heard stories, and she knew immediately what this creature was. The human took 1 step into the clearing, and then another, and it moved without hurry and without fear, and it kept its eyes on the wrecks the entire time. The largest wrecks hissed and demanded to know what the human wanted, and the human stopped walking and stood very still, and when it spoke its voice was low and even, and it said only 2 words: leave hers. The wrecks looked at each other and then back at the human, and Una could see them calculating and considering and remembering the stories that every species in the galaxy knew about humans. The human did not move and did not speak again, and it simply waited and watched, and something about its stillness was more frightening than any threat could have been. The largest Rex made a sound of disgust and turned away, and the other 2 followed, and they disappeared into the rocks, and the forest swallowed them up. Una stood alone in the clearing with the human stranger, and she did not know if she should run or stay or speak or be silent. The human walked over to where her water vessel lay on the ground and picked it up and carried it to the spring and knelt down and began to fill it. And when it was full, the human stood and walked toward her and held the vessel out. Una took it with shaking hands, and the human nodded once and asked her which way was home. She pointed down the path, and the human began to walk, and after a moment, Una followed, and she did not know what would happen next, but she knew that something had changed. The sun rose over the mountains of Vethkora, and for the first time in 2 cycles, Una walked the path home without fear. The human walked slowly, and Una realized after a few minutes that he was matching his pace to hers, and that he could have moved much faster if he wanted to, but he chose not to. She watched him from the corner of her eye as they moved down the path, and she noticed the way he looked at everything around them, and the way his eyes moved from the rocks to the trees to the shadows and back again without ever seeming to rest. He carried himself like someone who expected danger and was ready for it, and yet there was no tension in his body and no fear in his face. And Una found this confusing because the wrecks made everyone afraid. They walked in silence for a long time, and then the human spoke without looking at her and asked what her name was. She hesitated before answering because her mother had taught her to be careful with strangers, but this stranger had just saved her life, and so she told him, and she said her name Was Yuna. Human nodded and said that his name was Kang Do-hyun and that he was a surveyor and that his ship had broken down 2 days ago in the mountains to the east and that he had been walking toward the settlement to find parts for repairs. Yuna asked him if he knew about the wrecks before he came to this planet, and Do-hyun said that he had read about them in the survey reports, but that reading about something and meeting, it were two different things. She asked him why he had stepped into the clearing and why he had helped her when he could, and just walked away and stayed out of trouble. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment, and then he said that where he came from there was an old idea, that the strong should protect the weak, and that walking away from a child in danger was not something he could do and still look at himself in the mirror. Runa did not understand the mirror part, but she understood the rest, and she felt something warm spread through her chest, and she realized it was gratitude. They reached the edge of the settlement. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the other Karathi were awake now and moving through the streets, and they stopped and stared when they saw Yuna walking beside the tall human stranger. Do-hyun did not seem bothered by the stares, and he kept walking until Yuna pointed to her family shelter and said that this was where she lived. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, and Do-hyun waited at the entrance and did not enter without permission, and Yuna thought that this was polite of him. Her mother Selim was sitting up on her mat, and her face was pale and tired, but her eyes went wide when she saw the human standing in the doorway, and she tried to rise, but Yuna rushed to her side and told her to stay still. Yuna explained what had happened at the springs, and her mother listened with growing alarm, and when the story was finished, Selim looked at Do-hyun for a long time without speaking. Then she bowed her head and thanked him for saving her daughter, and Do-hyun bowed his head in return and said that no thanks were necessary and that he was glad he had been there at the right time. Selim asked him what he wanted in return, because in her experience nothing in this galaxy came without a cost, and kindness from strangers always had conditions added. Do-hyun said that he needed parts to repair his ship, and that he had heard the settlement had a salvage pile where broken equipment was stored, and that he was hoping to trade work for access to the parts he needed. Selim nodded slowly and said that she could arrange for him to speak with the settlement council, and that they would decide if a trade was possible. Thanked her and turned to leave, but then he stopped and looked back at Yuna and asked her what time she left for the springs each morning. Told him that she left before dawn when the sky was still dark, and Do-hyun nodded and said nothing else, and then he walked away into the settlement. Yuna watched him go, and her mother called her over and took her hands and looked into her eyes and asked her if she was truly unhurt. Yuna said that she was fine and that the wrecks had not touched her, and that the human had arrived before anything bad could happen. Selim pulled her daughter close and held her tight, and Yuna could feel her mother trembling, and she knew that the fear was not for herself, but for what could have happened. That night Yuna lay awake and thought about the human, and thought about the wrecks, and thought about all the mornings she had walked that path alone and afraid. She thought about how the wrecks had looked at Do-hyun and how they had hesitated, and how they had left without a fight, and she wondered what it was about humans that made even the wrecks afraid. The next morning, Yuna woke before dawn as always, and she dressed in the dark and picked up her water vessel and kissed her sleeping mother on the forehead and stepped outside into the cold air. She walked to the settlement gate and stopped. Do-hyun was standing there waiting for her. He did not say good morning, and he did not explain why he was there, and he simply fell into step beside her as she walked through the gate and started down the path toward the springs. Yuna looked up at him and asked if he was going to walk with her every day. Do-hyun said that he needed to survey the area around the springs anyway, and that walking with her was just efficient use of his time. Yuna knew that this was not the real reason, but she did not argue, and she did not complain, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time as they walked together through the purple pre-dawn light. She felt safe. The journey to the springs passed without incident, and the wrecks were nowhere to be seen. And Yuna filled her vessel and they walked back to the settlement together. At the gate, Do-hyun said that he would see her tomorrow morning, and then he walked away toward the salvage pile, where the council had agreed to let him search for parts of Yuna. Carried the water home to her mother, and Sillin drank deeply, and her breathing seemed a little easier than the day before. And Yuna allowed herself to hope that maybe things were going to be different now. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. And every morning, Do-hyun was waiting at the gate, and every morning, they walked to the springs together, and every morning, the Vrex watched from the rocks, but did not approach. The other Karathi began to talk about the human, and some said he was dangerous and could not be trusted, and others said he was a gift from the universe and should be treated with respect. Sallin remained cautious as she watched Do-hyun carefully whenever he came near, and she asked Yuna many questions about what he said and what he did. But even she could not deny that her daughter was happier than she had been in cycles, and that the fear that had lived behind Yuna's eyes for so long was beginning to fade on. The seventh morning, Yuna asked Do-hyun why he kept helping her when he did not have. Do-hyun walked in silence for a long time, and then he said that he had a daughter once, and that she had been about Yuna's age, and that she had lived on a colony that did not survive. He did not say what happened to the colony or to his daughter, and Yuna did not ask because she could see the pain in his eyes, and she understood that some wounds were too deep for words. They reached the springs and filled the vessel and started back toward the settlement. And Yuna reached out and took Do-hyun's hand and held it as they walked. Do-hyun looked down at her with surprise, and then his face softened and he squeezed her small hand gently, and they continued on in comfortable silence. The sun rose over the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Yuna thought that maybe the universe was not as cruel as she had believed. Do-hyun healed faster than anyone expected, and within 2 weeks, he was on his feet again and moving around the settlement as Do-hyun. If the fight had never happened, the Karathi healers were amazed, and they said they had never seen anything like it, and they asked him how it was possible. Do-hyun explained that humans had evolved on a planet that was constantly trying to kill them, and that their world had been full of predators and poisons and disasters of every kind, and that the humans who survived were the ones whose bodies learned to repair themselves quickly. He said it was not magic, and it was not special, and it was simply what humans were. Karathi listened, and they began to understand why the other species of the galaxy told so many stories about humans, and why even the Vrex had hesitated before attacking during his recovery. Do-hyun continued to work on getting parts for his ship, and the Karathi helped him now, and they gave him everything he needed without asking for anything. In return, Yuna visited him every day, and they talked about many things, and she asked him questions about Earth and about the human colonies and about all the places he had seen in his travels. Told her about oceans that stretched from one horizon to the other, and about mountains so tall that their peaks were always covered in snow, and about cities that held more people than she could imagine. She listened to every word, and her eyes were wide with wonder as she dreamed about seeing these things for herself someday. One morning, Do-hyun told her that his ship was almost ready and that he would be leaving soon. Yuna felt her heart sink, even though she had known this day would come, and she tried to be brave, and she tried not to cry. Do-hyun saw the look on her face, and he knelt down so that he was at her eye level. And he said that leaving did not mean forgetting, and that she had a place in his heart now, and that nothing would change that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, and he pressed it into her hand. It was an emergency beacon, he said, and it was modified to reach farther than normal, and if she ever needed help, she just had to press the button, and he would receive the signal anywhere within 3 systems. Sinin looked at the beacon, and then looked at him, and she asked if he really meant it. Do-hyun smiled and said that when a human made a promise, they kept it. The day of his departure came too quickly, and the whole settlement gathered to see him off, and Seelan stood with Yuna at the front of the crowd. Seelan's health had improved greatly over the past weeks, and the ash lung sickness was not gone, but it was manageable. now, and she could walk without help and breathe without pain. She thanked Do-yoon for everything he had done, and she said that her daughter was different now, and stronger and braver, and that this was because of him. Do-hyun said that Yuna had always been brave, and that he had simply helped her see it for herself. He hugged Yuna one last time, and she hugged him back as hard as she could, and she did not want to let go. She did, and she stepped back and she watched as he walked up the ramp of his ship, and the door closed behind him, and the engines roared to life, and the ship rose into the sky and disappeared among the stars. The months that followed were hard, but Yuna found that she could handle them, and the path to the springs was no longer terrifying, and the wrecks kept their distance, and life went on. She taught the other Karathi children what Do-hyun had taught her, and soon there were many who knew how to read tracks and identify danger and move through the forest without being seen. The U settlement grew stronger and more confident, and the fear that had hung over them for so long began to fade. Then one day the scouts reported that a Vrex warband was approaching, and this was not a raiding party of 8 or 10, but a force of over 100, and they were armed and organized, and they were coming for the settlement. The elders called an emergency meeting, and the discussion was frantic, and some said they should hide, and others said they should flee, and everyone was afraid. Yana stood up and pulled the beacon from her pocket, and she said that she knew someone who could help. The elders looked at her and asked what she meant, and she told them about Do-hyun and about his promise, and about the beacon he had given her. Some said it was foolish to trust a human who was probably far away by now and who had no reason to come back. Yuna did not argue with them, and she simply pressed the button. The beacon lit up and sent its signal out into the void, and Yuna put it back in her pocket and waited. 3 hours later, a ship appeared in the sky above the settlement. It was Do-han's ship, and it was battered and worn, but it was flying, and it descended through the atmosphere and landed in the field. Outside the gate, the ramp lowered, and Do-hyun walked out, and he was not alone. Behind him came 5 more humans, and they were men and women of different ages and sizes, but they all had the same calm look in their eyes that Yuna remembered. Do-hyun walked up to Yuna and smiled, and said that he had brought some friends. The Vrex warband arrived an hour later, and they came over the hills in a wave of scales and claws and weapons, and they expected to find a settlement full of terrified Karathi. Instead, they found 6 humans standing at the gate. The humans did not charge, and they did not shout, and they simply stood there and waited, and the message was clear. The Vrex stopped, and their leader looked at the humans and looked at the settlement behind them and calculated the odds. Then the warband turned and left, and not a single shot was fired. That evening the settlement held a celebration, and there was music and dancing and food and laughter, and the humans sat among the Karathi and shared in the joy. Yuna found Do-hyun sitting alone at the edge of the celebration, and she sat down beside him. She did not say anything at first, and they just watched the dancers together in comfortable silence. Then she asked him why he had come back. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he had made a promise and that humans kept their promises. Yuna nodded, and then she reached into her bag and pulled out a water vessel and held it out to him. She said that she had filled it at the springs that morning, and that she wanted him to have some. Do-hyun took the vessel and drank deeply, and the water was cool and clear, and he smiled. He said it was the best water he had ever tasted. Yuna smiled back and leaned against his shoulder and looked up at the stars. She thought about everything that had happened since that morning at the springs, when a stranger had stepped out of the forest and changed her life. She thought about fear and courage and the difference between them, and she understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She thought about the future and all the possibilities it held, and she was not afraid. The stars shone down on Beth Korra, and somewhere out there were countless worlds and countless species and countless stories waiting to be lived, and Yuna knew that whatever came next, she would face it with her head held high and her heart full of hope, because She had learned something important from a human stranger who had stopped to help a girl in danger. She had learned that kindness was a choice, and that protection was a promise, and that the universe was full of darkness, but it was also full of light. And sometimes all it took was one person standing up to make all the difference. The celebration continued long into the night, and the music echoed across the valley, and for the first time in a very long time the Karathi of Vethkora were truly happy, and watching over them all were the humans who had come when called, and who would always come when called, because that was what humans did. They protected the innocent, and they kept their promises, and they never ever gave up the end. On the 8th day, Dalyun did something different. Instead of simply walking beside Yuna in silence, he began to talk, and he asked her questions about the path and the forest and the places where she felt most afraid. Yuna answered honestly, and she told him about the narrow passage between the two large rocks where the Vrex liked to hide, and she told him about the section of path that curved around a blind corner where anything could be waiting. Dohyun listened carefully and nodded, and then he began to teach her. He said that he could not always be there to walk with her, and that someday he would have to leave, and that when that day came she needed to be able to protect herself. Yuna felt a cold fear grip her heart at the thought of him leaving, but she pushed it away and focused on his words. Dohyun explained that fighting was not the only way to survive, and that for someone like her who was smaller and weaker than the Vrex, there were other methods that worked better. He taught her how to read the ground for tracks, and how to tell fresh prints from old ones, and how to know if something had passed through recently or long ago. He taught her how to identify the places where ambush were most likely, and how to move through those areas quickly and quietly without drawing attention. Taught her how to make sounds that would carry far, and how to create distractions that would confuse anyone trying to follow. Or he taught her how to run in patterns that were hard to predict, and how to use the terrain to her advantage, and how to find hiding spots that even the use the terrain to her advantage, and how to find hiding spots that even the Rex would overlook. Yuna absorbed everything he said, and she practiced as they walked, and she asked questions when she did not understand, and Dohyun answered everyone with patience. The days passed and the lessons continued, and Yuna felt herself changing and growing and becoming something more than she had been before. She was still small and still fragile, and she would never be able to fight a Vrex in direct combat. But now she had other weapons, and those weapons were knowledge and awareness and speed. One evening after they returned from the springs, Seelan asked to speak with Dohyun alone, and Yuna watched from the window as they talked. Outside the shelter she could not hear what they said, but she could see her mother's face and the expressions that crossed it, and she saw suspicion give way to understanding, and then something that might have been acceptance when Dohyun left and Seelan came back inside. Yuna asked her what they had talked about. Seelan sat down on her mat and was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had asked Dohyun what he wanted and why he was really helping them. Yuna asked what he had said. Seelan said that he had told her about his daughter and about the colony and about the guilt he carried for not being there when they needed him, and about how helping Yuna made him feel like he was doing something good in a galaxy that had taken so much from him. She said that she believed him and that she was grateful, but that she was also afraid because nothing lasted forever, and because one day he would leave and Yuna would have to face the world alone again. Yuna thought about this, and then she said that she was not the same girl she had been 2 weeks ago, and that Dohyun had given her something that could not be taken away. Seelan smiled sadly and reached out and touched her daughter's face and said that she could see the change, and that she was proud. The next morning, Yuna woke before dawn as always, but something felt wrong and she could not say what it was until she stepped outside and saw the gathering at the settlement gate. A group of Karathi elders was standing there, and they were speaking in low, urgent voices, and when Yuna approached, they fell silent and looked at her with worried eyes. One of the elders told her that scouts had seen a large group of wrecks moving through the forest during the night, and that they were heading toward the settlement, and that everyone should stay inside until the danger passed. Yuna felt her heart drop into her stomach because her mother needed water and the supply at home was almost gone. And if she did not go to the springs today, there would be nothing for Seelin to drink. She looked around for Do-hyun, but he was not at the gate, and one of the elders said that the human had left early that morning to work on his ship in the mountains, and that he might not return until evening. Yuna stood at the gate and looked down the path toward the springs, and she felt the old fear rising up inside her, and it wrapped around her chest like cold fingers. But then she thought about everything Do-hyun had taught her, and she thought about her mother lying sick at home, and she thought about what kind of person she wanted to be. She told the elders that she had to go, and that her mother's life depended on it. The elders tried to stop her, and they said it was too dangerous, and that she should wait for the human to return. Yuna shook her head and said that waiting was not an option, and that she had learned how to survive, and that she would be careful. She walked through the gate before anyone could stop her, and she felt the eyes of the entire settlement watching as she disappeared down the path. The forest was quiet and still, and Yuna moved slowly and carefully, and she used everything Do-hyun had taught her. She checked for tracks and found fresh wrecks prints heading east away from the path, and she felt a small measure of relief. She identified the danger points and moved through them quickly, and she kept to the shadows and made no sound. She reached the springs without seeing a single wrecks, and she filled her vessel as fast as she could, and then she started back halfway home. She heard voices ahead, and she froze and listened, and the voices were speaking in the rasping language of the wrecks. Yuna slipped off the path and into the undergrowth, and she found a hiding spot beneath a fallen tree, and she made herself as small as possible, and she waited. 3 wrecks walked past her hiding spot, and they were so close that she could have reached out and touched them, and her heart was pounding so loud that she was certain they would hear it. But they did not stop, and they did not look, and they continued down the path and disappeared around a bend. Yuna waited until she could no longer hear them, and then she waited some more, and then she crept out of her hiding spot and ran. She ran faster than she had ever run before, and she did not stop until she burst through the settlement gate and collapsed on the ground with the water vessel clutched against her chest. The elders gathered around her, and they were amazed that she had made it back safely, and they helped her to her feet, and someone took the vessel and carried it to her shelter. Yuna walked home on shaking legs, and when she stepped inside, her mother was awake and waiting, and Seelin pulled her into her arms and held her tight. That evening Do-hyun returned from the mountains, and he heard what had happened, and he found Yuna sitting outside her shelter watching the sunset. He sat down beside her and did not speak for a long time, and then he said that he was proud of her. Yuna looked up at him and smiled and said that she had a good teacher. Do-hyun smiled back, and the smile reached his eyes, and for a moment the sadness that lived there seemed to fade. The sun set over Vethkora, and the stars came out one by one, and Yuna thought about the future, and for the first time she was not afraid of it. The peace lasted for 3 more days, and then the wrecks came back. They came in the morning when the sky was just beginning to lighten, and Yuna and Do-hyun were halfway to the springs when they appeared on the path ahead. There were 8 of them this time, and they stood in a line that blocked the entire trail, and their eyes were cold and angry, and their claws were extended. The largest wreck stepped forward, and Yuna recognized him as the leader from before, and he spoke in his rasping voice and said that they had waited long enough, and that the human needed to learn that Vethkora belonged to the wrecks and no one else. Stopped walking and placed himself between Yuna and the raiders, and his body was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He told Yuna to run home. Yuna did not move. He told her again, and his voice was firm, and there was no room for argument. Yuna took a few steps back, but she did not run, and instead she slipped behind a large rock where she could watch without Being seen, the Vrex leader laughed and said that the human was brave, but foolish, and that bravery did not matter when the numbers were 8 against 1. Do-yoon did not respond, and he simply waited and watched as the Vrex spread out in a half circle. Around him, the first Vrex attacked from the right, and it was fast, and its claws sliced through the air where Do-yoon's head had been a moment before. But Do-yoon had moved, and he caught the Vrex's arm and twisted, and there was a sound like dry wood snapping, and the Vrex screamed and fell back, clutching its broken limb too. More came at once from different directions, and Do-yoon could not dodge them both, and one set of claws caught him across the shoulder and tore through his shirt and drew blood. He grunted in pain but did not stop moving, and he drove his fist into the throat of one attacker and kicked the legs out from under the other. Yuna watched from behind her rock, and she had never seen anything like this, and she was terrified and amazed at the same time. The Vrex were faster than Do-yoon, and there were so many of them, and every time he knocked one down, another was there to take its place. They hit him again and again, and he bled from cuts on his arms and his face and his chest. But he did not fall, and he did not stop fighting. One of the Vrex grabbed him from behind, and another slashed at his stomach, and Do-yoon twisted at the last moment and took the blow on his side instead, and he threw his head back and smashed it into the face of the Vrex holding him. The Vrex let go, and Do-yoon spun and kicked it in the chest and sent it flying backward into 2 of its companions. 4 Vrex were down now, and 4 remained standing, and they circled Do-yoon more carefully than before, and there was something new in their eyes that looked almost like respect. The leader hissed an order, and the remaining Vrex attacked all at once, and Do-yoon disappeared under a pile of scaled bodies and claws and teeth. Yuna pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from screaming, and she wanted to help, but there was nothing she could do against so many. Then she saw movement in the pile, and Do-yoon's arm emerged, and it was covered in blood, but it was still strong, and he grabbed one of the Vrex and pulled it down, and there was a crack, and the Vrex went limp. He fought his way back to his feet, and 2 more Vrex went down before the leader finally got behind him and wrapped his arms around Do-yoon's throat and bore him down to the ground. Do-yoon struggled, but the leader was strong, and the other remaining Vrex pinned his arms and legs, and he could not break free. Leader put his claws against Do-yoon's throat and said that the human had fought well, but that it was over now, and that this was the end. Do-hyun looked past the leader, and his eyes found Yuna's hiding spot, and he looked directly at her, and she saw no fear in his face and no regret, and then he winked. Before Yuna could understand what that meant, Do-yoon slammed his forehead into the leader's face with all the strength he had left. The impact was terrible, and both of them went limp, and the other Vrex holding Do-yoon jumped back in shock. For a long moment no one moved, and the only sound was the wind in the trees. Then one of the standing Vrex grabbed the unconscious leader, and another grabbed a fallen companion, and they began to retreat, and the others followed, and they did not look back as they disappeared into the forest. Yuna rushed out from behind her rock and ran to Do-yoon and fell to her knees beside him, and she was certain he was dead. But then his chest rose and fell, and his eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at her and smiled. And it was a broken smile full of pain, but it was still a smile. He said that he thought he had told her to run. Yuna was crying now, and she could not stop, and she said that she was not good at following orders. Do-yoon laughed and then winced and said that she should work on that. She helped him sit up and then stand, and he leaned heavily on her shoulder, and they began the slow walk back to the settlement. Was too hurt to walk on his own, and Yuna was too small to support him fully, but together they managed, and they moved step by step down the path toward home. When they reached the settlement gate, the Karathi who saw them stopped and stared, and word spread quickly, and by the time they made it to Seolin's shelter, a crowd had gathered. They saw the blood on Do-yoon's body and the cuts and bruises covering his skin, and they saw how Yuna supported him, even though she was half his size, and something changed in the way they looked at him. This was not a stranger anymore, And this was not an unknown variable to be feared. This was someone who had bled for them and who had fought for one of their children and who had won Seolin. Came out of the shelter when she heard the commotion, and her face went pale when she saw Do-hyun's condition. She called for the healers, and they came quickly. And they brought Do-hyun inside and laid him on a mat and began to clean his wounds. Yuna sat beside him and held his hand and refused to leave. Even when the healers said she was in the way, Do-hyun squeezed her hand weakly and said that he was going to be fine and that humans were harder to kill than most species thought. Silin stood in the doorway and watched, and there were tears on her face, and she did not try to hide them. That night, the settlement gathered outside Silen's shelter, and they sang the old songs of gratitude and protection, and the sound carried across the valley and into the mountains beyond. Yuna sat inside with the lawn and listened to the singing, and she thought about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The human who had been a stranger was a stranger no longer, and she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together.